Brought to you by PrayLatin.com, makers of prayer cards featuring complete English phonetic renderings of Latin pronunciations.
There's a bishop, Jose Ignacio Munilla. He gave an interview to a Spanish news site called El Debate, probably saying that wrong. And in his interview, he has some words of wisdom. And this is, I think, an important topic today for us to think about. Many Christians have become enemies of the cross, seeking the applause of the world while not rectifying their own internal disposition, their own internal sinful disposition, their inclination to sin, their inclination to treat their neighbor like garbage, all of it. This bishop accuses the human element of the church of seeking consensus with the world and using the institutions of the church by not preaching against positions the world holds dear, such as the James Martin sin, because it's a hard thing to do. You don't get the admiration of the world when you do that. And instead, the human element of the church focuses on things that the world agrees with or is easy for the church to adapt its teachings to, like, say, the issue of people moving around a lot from one place to another, or care for our common home, to bring up something that, because you may have forgotten, we are firmly in the anniversary year of Laudato Si, the most self-referential thing Francis has ever done. He issued Laudato Si on care for our common home, and that happened in 2015, and we are in this sort of 10-year anniversary celebration of it, which is the weirdest thing, if you read church history, the weirdest thing to actually see. But he points all of this bishop points all of this to being part of the secularization of the church. And about the only thing the bishop doesn't do here is point out that this temptation puts church leadership on the same side of hot-button political discussions as the rulers of the world, many of whom stand against what their people want on these issues, and often the human element of the church twisting the teachings of the church to accommodate those who are actually the enemies of Christ. But the bishop's overall point is accurate. Christians have become lukewarm in preaching the truth to the world, and we must take a hard stand against the overreaches of the secularists and resist this temptation to secularize our own thinking. And so this was published on a website called El Debate under the headline, "Some Christians Seek the Applause of the World." The Bishop of Orihuela Alicante does not shy away from issues in which we know that the Christian worldview is very contrary to what is socially accepted. I'm going to go over a few of the questions and answers he gave, because you'll see that he's basically correct here. He just, in my estimation, doesn't go far enough to point to church leadership as part of the problem. So he has asked the following question. You mentioned in your speech that there is a, quote, certain secularization within the church itself, a Christianity that seeks to be socially applauded. Where are the symptoms? How can they be identified? How to avoid having the sour face that Pope Francis warns about? Familiar with the sour-faced saints comments from Francis? That a lot of people would-be saints in our time are pretty dour figures. Yeah, how to avoid that, how to avoid becoming a negative Nelly, basically. The bishop's response is, a symptom that we may be falling into an area of secularization where the only thing that is sought is the applause of the world is limiting or curtailing the preaching of the church to certain areas in which it is easier to seek a social consensus, and leaving silent other aspects in which we know that the church worldview is very contrary. It is much easier, for example, to have an ecological discourse or one on the phenomenon of human beings moving about a lot than to talk about other problems such as anthropological wounds, or the influence of the James Martin lobby, or Christian thinking about marriage as made by God and conforming to nature, or about what we truly think about why the James Martin sin is not part of God's plan when he created man. I believe that integrity is very important to preaching faith and morality. The fact that St. John the Baptist was a martyr for moral truth, and that he lost his head for having denounced that Herod was living with a woman who was not his wife, should challenge us. There are certain things that we seem to have forgotten. Each person must examine his conscience. There must be integrity in preaching without adapting the preaching of the gospel to his own sensibilities. I mean, do not adapt the gospel to your own worldview. It is true that when preaching moral truth, when it goes against the grain, can lead to having a sour face. But I believe that moral truth must be shown in its beauty. For example, the fact that we show the joy of the gospel in families that are faithful to marriage, in family counseling centers that have saved them from marital breakdown, in people who have received support for their emotional wounds, and thanks to that have been able to move forward. Some may think that addressing countercultural issues is only entering into the genre of denunciation, and I believe that there must also be a proclamation that there is hope, that the great moral evils that are spreading do not fill the heart of man. Those who have had the experiences of being rescued from these moral evils are the first witnesses. This is far from translating into a sour face, but quite the opposite. It is a testimony of hope, which means that the style with which things are done is very important. End quote. He's not wrong. It's very easy for us to denounce the sins of the world without presenting a joyful alternative. And I can tell you, as a adult convert myself, I can tell you that one of the things that really brought me into the church was I saw the moral chaos outside, but I could never figure out what was at the core of it, what was wrong. It was a friend of mine who was Catholic taught me about what the church taught about holy matrimony. And that was the thing that finally did it for me, which is not what I would have expected if you had talked to me 10 years before it happened. But that's what it was. And they taught, it was the beauty of what the church teaches. That was what counteracted the own sort of sinful godlessness in my own life. And here, this bishop's kind of driving at that point, that you can use the beauty of the truth to counteract the evils of the world. Not merely denunciations, but you actually have to actually offer something else beyond just saying no. There's a lot of truth to it. And then he's asked, lately there have been priests and nuns in the media who talk a lot about building bridges, seem to be seeking to reconcile themselves with the world where everything fits. We must be understanding with women who have had the sacrifice to Moloch, with men with the James Martin inclination. We cannot be so harsh with divorcees. Are they wolves in sheep's clothing? To which he says, I think that the great, great temptation in seeking balance is to admit that there is a contradiction between truth and charity. If we admit that, if we believe in that dialectic, then we are lost. We do not believe that there is a contradiction between saying, woman, I do not condemn you, go in peace, and adding, sin no more. Jesus Christ is the truth, and Jesus Christ is charity. He is not a half-truth to make it easier to combine him with mediocrity. He who believes in this dialectic must deep down say, I must lower the truth that it is easier to combine it with mediocrity. No, that is to have fallen in the Hegelian dialectic, to seek a synthesis after a thesis and after an antithesis. We do not believe in that. We believe that Jesus Christ is truth and charity. Let me give you a simple example of what this looks like in real life. Weirdly, right now over on X, you will see Catholics, usually young Catholic men, usually with anonymous accounts, pictures of saints or anime characters as their little avatar, yelling at people for moral failings. And this isn't just for like current unrepented moral failings. They're actually going after people who have publicly repented of their sins, but saying that those people should just shut up and not speak on anything. It's rather disturbing because there is a remarkable lack of charity in all of this. This isn't merely that the person that they're attacking has sinned. They are going after people who have publicly repented of their sins, and people who, because of those past sins of theirs, might actually know something about being mired in that kind of sin. They're told to just shut up. That doesn't help anything. Now, the bishop goes on and is asked, you also said in your lecture that we have become enemies of the cross and that we must embrace the cross. The interviewer says, I remember a priest preaching along the same lines, but he said, first, one must know how to identify the cross, because if not, one can end up embracing crosses that are not one's own. Here's what he means by being an enemy of the cross. This is not we are, antichrist, the little a antichrists. Doesn't mean it that way, and it doesn't mean that we are trying to destroy the faith or anything else. You have to remember, sin darkens the intellect, and when you are not in a state of grace, you have placed yourself in opposition to Jesus Christ. It's a hard teaching. You'll see the saints say 1,000 times throughout history, and the church repeating this in the various preconciliar catechisms. So here is what the bishop has to say. He says, He says, if we're not embracing crosses that are not one's own, he replies, that's true. Because, for example, there may be someone who is suffering a lot because of family relations or within the company. And deep down, behind that suffering, what happens is that I have jealousy or a wounded self-esteem or an inferiority complex. It's very important that I do not make a victim-like interpretation. I have the worst coworker or the worst brother-in-law in the world. Look, the problem is not with the brother-in-law. I have jealousy or I have a huge inferiority complex. Of course, I have to embrace the cross, but it is true that it has to be identified. It has to be named. As always, the biggest cross is within ourselves. That is why very important to identify, not mistake our enemy. It is also very important to identify the evil one, to unmask his temptations and be aware that the biggest cross we carry is our own wounds, which we have forged in our lives by our sins. What he's saying when we have become enemies of the cross is that our own sins mask our perception of things, and that we have essentially in some way or another we lash out at other people because of our own sinful nature. It's a hard thing for people to hear, but is he wrong in saying that? All right, folks, thanks very much for tuning in today. As always, pray for the church. I'm Anthony Stine. Ave Maria.